So here is a look or a view of the project I decided to undertake. Uh, it obviously got developed, well, at least for me, by the data set I selected because until I selected a data set, I really didn't know what it was I was going to do. So my search to follow the parameters of the assignment of the database of the right size ultimately led me to the Pew Research Center, which is owned by the Pew Charitable Trust, which is a giant philanthropic foundation. It funds a lot of different efforts, including PBS programming. The Pew Research Center does all nonpartisan research in a lot of different subjects. It's all in the public interest. There's no financial or political agendas. So you tend to think that it tends to be very reliable. Now, the data set used in my project comes from their journalism project where they examine the impact of the media. Now, one of the regular studies that the Journalism Project does is what's called the News Coverage Index, or NCI. That's where this data set comes from. It categorizes the top stories that are published by America's top media outlets. Those include 11 daily newspapers with national interest like the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, news programs from all the broadcast TV networks, including PBS, news programs from cable networks, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, as well as some of the opinion programs that those cable networks carry. News programs from ABC and CBS radio networks, NPR news programs, syndicated radio talk shows hosted by Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, and Ed O'Brien, as well as content from a dozen top news sites on the internet like Yahoo News, Google News, the websites of CNN, New York Times, Fox News, ABC. Now, this NCI data set is the most recently published, which was from January to June of 2012. Now, the way this data set works is that each story that meets the criteria for a major news story is categorized by a number of different parameters. So we'll take a look at those. First, and obviously most important, the story date. Next, the media source, those that we just mentioned, newspaper, TV news, radio news, website. Broadcast start time. Obviously, the start time, if it's a broadcast story, this is a series of nines, which means it doesn't apply. And the duration for a broadcast news story in seconds obviously doesn't apply. And then in the case of a published article, the word count of that story. Now, it also takes into account the placement or prominence of the story, whether it's above the fold or below the fold, whether it's first, second, or third in a particular newscast. And then the story format, which is kind of a more technical aspect of the story, how it was published or how it was broadcast. It's especially appropriate for TV and radio that will put news stories in several different formats or methods. Now, a couple of the really big variables in this data set. One of them is the big story topic. Now, this has about 250 different topics that were developed during the timeline of this NCI. As stories were tagged for use in the data set, new big story topics were created if they weren't already in use, which is going to happen when you have various kinds of breaking news stories. Because of that, some of these big story topics only have a few stories associated with them, while others have a lot more. For example, the 2012 presidential campaign obviously had many more stories, and that's one of the big story topics. Now, there's also a more general topic group, which is this topic group here. It has about maybe a little more than 24 topics that will vary from study to study. Most of them tend to be more generic and are carried forward from each NCI to NCI. And then finally, lead newsmakers are categorized. Lead newsmaker 1 is for the single or the most prominent person that's featured in that story. Newsmaker 2 is for an additional or secondary person that's featured. If no lead newsmaker is in the story, nothing is listed. If only one, then only one is included. Now, the relevance of this data set became a lot more obvious to me after I had to think about it a little bit. I realized that, well, it was a presidential election year, 2012. We elected a president. We reelected President Obama. And of course, we're going through a presidential election right now, and we're going through that same period of time now during the semester as this data set covered from January to the beginning of June. So it seemed like there were some parallels there that might be very interesting to examine, and it just made sense to, since I had this information about media coverage of top news stories, to look into how the media covers politics, how it covers campaigns, how it covers politicians, and do some serious research into that. And so the literature review that was a part of this examined that media influence, but it also, we started off by looking at some other ways that the media covers various things. For example, we started with the examination of media coverage of national disasters and some sports teams that became news stories, as well as certain health issues. Then there was a critical analysis of media performance in several different areas. Then it transitions into the media coverage of politics and politicians, and then into the media coverage of elections, including presidential campaigns. And what the literature review revealed was that it really supported what is a lot of people consider a jaded view, that the media is really not as unbiased as they would like us to believe. I think that we all like to believe that some media is unbiased while others are not. The whole fair and balanced concept, we like to joke about it, but really, from what I've learned, really no one is as fair and balanced as they want us to believe that they are. And there's a lot of evidence of that. There's examples of media accounts that seem favorable to our government when the facts really don't support that or in conflict with it. There's evidence of media giving favorable coverage to entities that were either financially or otherwise connected to the owners of those media companies. A lot of the sources for the stories that are being covered come from the press counterparts for companies, government agencies, politicians, and campaigns, those media advisors or PR people, and further evidence that a lot of those PR people were able to drive news stories because of their influence and their connections to these reporters, many of whom they were colleagues with at one time. And then media coverage of presidential candidates, there was evidence that it tended to show at least some political bias. There were examples of more positive stories written about President Obama on CNN, MSNBC, and PBS, while there were more positive stories about Mitt Romney featured on Fox News and the Wall Street Journal. So all of this analysis and the conclusions that the media, the literature review provided, created a really good transition into a study of the 2012 presidential campaign using the data set as evidence of what the media was actually doing. Well, the hypotheses in this study focused on President Obama and Mitt Romney because they were the ultimate party nominees. There could be other hypotheses to consider those early Republican candidates that were a part of the nominating campaign that the media was covering, and it would be very interesting to analyze how they were covered and how the stories about them increased or decreased as time went on. The hope here is that the analysis of the coverage that I could do in this study would provide a little better insight as to how media approaches these campaigns so that some of the biases could be exposed and hopefully avoided. So it was very interesting, and I think it would be very interesting indeed to be able to do the study and do the analysis and find some interesting conclusions from all of it. So there you go.